here podcast where we neurodivergently ask and answer the question, why are we here, and other important questions. So, today I was going to talk about JFK for people in Gen X, because I am in Gen X. I'm actually also in the little, the parts of the generations that are of two different generations, because I was born in 79, so I'm in Gen X, but I'm also in millennial. Zennial, I think. I can't remember. There was a word. But I don't really put a whole lot of stock in the generation thing, but I do put a lot of stock in approximately the time period that you grew up in is a pretty big determinant of a bunch of stuff. So, to put a bunch of people from 20 years in a group, it's got a lot of similarities. So anyway, JFK for me was learning about it from my dad first. He was a history buff and knew a lot of stuff about a lot of things, everything history, but he was fascinated with JFK assassination. He used to tell me, that he remembered exactly where he was, like a lot of people. That was one of the first events that everybody found out about live. I don't think it was the first major, world-stopping event, but it might have been because of the way that the broadcast TV was. I mean, November 22nd, 1963, for anybody who doesn't know. JFK assassinated Dealey Plaza, Dallas. Pretty much everybody knows. When I was growing up, the question was it a conspiracy? It was, it couldn't have possibly been that guy, Lee Harvey Oswald. And, there was a lot of, JFK was in a lot of different pop culture things. And, Newman from Seinfeld was in JFK.
To frame him, obviously.
There's a lot of smoke there, but there's some fire.
And with the mountain of evidence that existed already in the 90s, it's just been, since then, another 30 years that people have had to just delve into stuff. More records being available, the internet, people being to, collaborate easier. It's just kind of, it's been, as everybody knows, it's been like jet fuel to everything that was knowledge-based. So today, it's obvious it was conspiracy. The question is, how high up did it go in our government? Because somebody in our government had to have known. There were too many CIA people involved as far as weapons and credentials, documents, stuff like that. I haven't seen any direct evidence to implicate any, high officials. But there are several kind of deathbed confessions of guys that got old that were involved. And if you believe them, then the CIA was a lot more involved, and organized crime and the CIA kind of worked together, because Kennedy represented a major barrier to the establishment. I mean, a lot of people know this, but he didn't back them up with air support and the Bay of Pigs, and it made a lot of people mad. That was a big CIA operation, and they don't, those guys don't like it when that kind of thing happens from a bureaucrat. But he was pretty determined not to enter Vietnam, and almost immediately after Lyndon Johnson took over, were those...
Lyndon Johnson signs National Security Memo 273, which essentially reverses Kennedy's new withdrawal policy and gives a green light to covert action against North Vietnam, which provoked the Gulf of Tonkin incident.
It provoked the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was the point.
Just get me elected. I'll give you your damn war.
In that document lay the Vietnam War.
And then we were in the war. And like Mr. X says in JFK, which has got a lot of shit in it that was a lot more true than I thought. But all those companies that were going out of business, and then Vietnam happened, and then bam, war is very profitable. Obviously, most of the, people that have wealth, most of their kids are not drafted one way or another. So it's just really sending the lower class off to fight to make the upper class even more money. And that's how most things are in capitalism. It's like, if it's already doing something, it's going to do it even more. But to a Gen X person, we were still, back then, like in the 90s, there was enough innocence left that it still felt like a part of the same time period as the 60s. Now, it doesn't even, like, that's a different universe. I mean, the internet and social media has changed everyday life so much. And I say so much, not for everybody. If we look around the world, not everybody even has electricity. So the people that are in countries like the United States, people like me, people that are in any developed country, basically live like kings relative to how people that don't have a lot in other countries live. I think this has become kind of common knowledge that, that the wealth and the pollution and the consumption and production of the developed countries dwarfs, an underdeveloped country, which is to say the old way. The less electricity, slower, a lot of people think better, and I tend to be one of them, way of life that, where there's a lot more emphasis on making and doing the things that you need for yourself. And I'm sure, there still would be specialization where there'd be a guy that was a baker and a guy that made shoes, and the guy that made shoes would make shoes for the baker. I mean, it's not like it would be everybody does literally everything for themselves, but more so than it is now. It's a different world today. And learning about Kennedy and growing up, hearing about it, talking about it, like hearing the coincidence that Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy, and Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln, and, learning all the little details about the magic bullet. There was Seinfeld episode. I mean, anybody that grew up when I grew up these were like iconic things. So when I say anybody, not literally anybody, but growing up in the 90s, if you watched much TV, it's hard not to know about Seinfeld and the episode where they did the back and to the left thing for the Keith Hernandez spitting on Kramer.
Well, that's the way it happened.
What happened to your head when you got hit?
Well, my head went back to the left.
Say that again.
Back and to the left.
Back and to the left. The spit then splashed off the wrist, pauses in midair, mind you. Makes a...
And I hadn't really thought too much about that in a while, but so learning about JFK today is kind of like it's just one in a long string of things where we've learned that the government's full of shit, that you can't trust the government, that it does all kinds of evil, fucked up stuff. And when it happened, that hadn't happened yet. So it was like people couldn't believe that it was a conspiracy. It wasn't even an option at first. But, there were enough. And I would say it seemed like the wool was pretty successfully pulled over the eyes of the public for a while. And I don't know exactly when that started to break, but I know that when I was learning about this stuff growing up, when 10, 11, 12 years old, at the very end of the 80s, it was still an open question whether it was a conspiracy, only because it seemed like, our government would never kill our president. And the scene with Mr. X in the movie really does a very good job of laying it all out.
I never realized Kennedy was so dangerous to the establishment. Is that why?
Well, that's a real question, isn't it? Why? The how and the who is just scenery for the public. Oswald, Ruby, Cuba, the mafia. Keeps them guessing like some kind of parlor game, prevents them from asking the most important question, why? Why was Kennedy killed? Who benefited? Who has the power to cover it up? Who?
Like the money interest, the power interest, the ego interest, the intelligence people that he screwed over, and the kind of power that they wielded. It's very believable that somebody extremely high in our government was like hands on involved in it. I didn't want to believe that, but that's the difference between growing up now is you pretty much are already jaded and already suspicious and already know that it's probably a conspiracy before even really looking into it much. So when I was learning about it, it was like this kind of dark chapter of American history that not everybody really thought much about. It wasn't really a mainstream. It was a conspiracy theory, I guess. That's about the best way to put it. It was a conspiracy theory, and today everybody knows that it was a conspiracy. It's not a theory, because it's pretty much provable. I mean, Oswald hadn't fired a gun. The gun they said he used was really inaccurate. Just that, and then finding a bullet that was pristine in the hospital after they hadn't found a bullet originally. I mean, like now it seems like absurd that anybody ever believed it at all. But that's the point I'm trying to make is now it seems absurd that anybody ever believed it wasn't a conspiracy. But when I was learning about it, we still didn't know if it was a conspiracy. So it was like kind of cool. And as I got older, it started to be more and more obvious that it was not a conspiracy. I mean, that it was not a question. It was definitely a conspiracy. There was no doubt whatsoever at a certain point. And I don't remember exactly what age I was or what I had learned about that made me positive. Like positive, not, yeah, that's a lot of suspicious stuff, but certain. And I can't remember what it was, but I know that for a long time, I walked around thinking, there's guys that participated in that assassination. There's a guy that fired the fatal shot, and they're, living a life somewhere, and nobody knows who they are. And recently I saw on YouTube a couple of these interviews with these guys that one of them said he was the fatal bullet shooter, and the other one was just a support guy who helped get weapons there and knew a bunch of details that, honestly, he probably could have found out other ways, or he could have been a lot less involved and like exaggerated a bunch of stuff. It's not a hands down. I mean, one of them seems very believable to me. The other one, kind of not. But there are probably more than those two. I haven't really looked for it because, it was a conspiracy. And the details are interesting, but it's really just sadder and sadder the more of the actual. Like, I guess part of what I'm saying is the more certain of it being a conspiracy it is, the less interesting it is. It was only fun when it was like, when you weren't sure, when it was a mystery. And today, you don't have that ability. You can't learn the first stages of it and then like proceed. Like you find it all out at once. I mean, it's basically, hey, our government killed our president. Okay, that's pretty much how it is now. But when I was learning about it, it was like years of finding out a little bit of facts at a time and starting to draw your own conclusions that the same conclusion, conspiracy. So, but to me, the defining part of it is that the 90s, especially the early 90s, were still, I mean, I was 12 in 1992, so I was still a kid. And so for me to say the world still seemed a certain way, would mostly be me probably just being 12. But there is a real difference between, I mean, Gen X, the reason it's kind of cool to be Gen X is because we grew up before computers. I mean, when I was a kid, there were still phones that had the little dials on it where it go, and there were still phone booths. And I mean, the world was very different. And so obviously now there's what there is now. And so I've lived with both. We're the youngest generation to have been around before computers and social media and all that stuff. So, you know, that's a pretty distinct dividing line, the internet. And, you know, when I went to college, I didn't have email when I lived in my parents' house. But when I got to college, I got an email address. So it was like that. I mean, you didn't have an account for anything when you went to college. There weren't accounts to have. There were, you know, there was Nintendos and Segas, and I think PlayStation had come out. But, I mean, there weren't computer games. You could still ride around with no seatbelts, smoke in restaurants. So Gen X was, you know, we kind of bridged the gap, and literally bridged the gap between the boomers who are never going to learn computers and people today who are growing up already knowing how to use computers by the time they're 8 years old. And, you know, I say use computers sounds old and square and stuff, because it's not using computers, it's just being in the world. And the world, I mean, anybody younger than, I don't know, 35 grew up with computers. So you got to be older than that to remember before computers. And I am. I wish I was younger, obviously. If I could be 30, I think I would choose to be 30. But, you know, that obviously isn't how that works. So I hope that, you know, if you're like me, you learned probably about JFK from your dad for the first time. And then you saw the movie. And
Y'all gotta start thinking on a different level, like the CIA does. Now, we're through the looking glass here, people. White is black, and black is white. Just maybe Oswald is exactly what he said he was. A patsy.
And then you started learning more. And over the last 20 years, you have probably come to the conclusion that it's very, you know, the only question is who participated and how much in the conspiracy. There's no question that it was a conspiracy, and that organized crime was involved heavily. And the CIA seems blatantly obvious that they were involved somehow, or at least some of their assets and some of their agents. So that's the CIA. I mean, but this is obviously not an existential question, but societally, the reason everybody remembered where they were is because a lot of people loved JFK. He was young and charismatic, and the speeches that he gave, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, you can't underestimate how much of a hero he was. Like, they had to get under their desks at school and do nuclear bomb drills, like my dad did. They would literally, the sirens would go off, they would get under their desk and prepare for a nuclear war. So when the missile crisis happened and Russia was trying to bring missiles to Cuba, and we intercepted, and they were like, get the fuck out of the way, and we were like, hell no, and it was a showdown, and it could have gone, I mean, we could all not be here on that day. I think it was 3 days. And however much of it was really Kennedy is up for a little bit of debate, but it looked like back when it happened, it appeared that he single-handedly like beat the Russians and saved the world. So he was a hero. And people that were involved in politics knew that he was trying to keep us out of Vietnam, and that he was trying to dismantle the intelligence agencies that had gotten too powerful and all that type of stuff. So there were a lot of forces that he was against that were dark and big, but he, to the country, he seemed just like a hero, and he was awesome. And like, why would anybody ever? I mean, people were distraught, and shocked. And I mean, it was not just the president, but a very popular president. And I believe that that's the day that our country kind of went off of a path that was the last chance to actually, to go a different direction. And Eisenhower warned about the military-industrial complex. I am pretty sure that is what took him out. It was money at the end of the day. These companies wanted Vietnam to happen, and they thought Vietnam should happen. So he was a barrier to that, and they had to get rid of him. And lots of billions of dollars went into lots of already rich people's pockets because of that war. Then RFK and MLK were both killed. And, ironic, I guess, the three Ks and who they were and the time period it was. All conspiracies, all assassinations, it was a very, but he was the first one. And so many people lost a lot of hope when that happened. And, it's not, he had a lot of issues that most people aren't aware of. Like he was a lot more broken and had a lot darker of a side than most people are aware of. And, that just makes him more human. But, back then in politics, the dark stuff didn't come out. It was still a gentleman's game, and dirty stuff happened, but there were things that were off limits. And I don't know, it was a very interesting, when I started thinking about how it is for Gen X and that assassination and the way that things have unfolded, and the truth that is known now and how it was to learn about it. It struck me as a really fascinating, almost case study. Assassination, a certain amount of time, internet, just the way, and the fact that I got to experience it from the point that I did, which, was right when the conspiracy started to unravel, and everybody started to think that it may have been, and then was. And how big of an event it was, and how much it got into pop culture. All of it. I wanted to talk this kind of off the cuff about it, and then I'll probably do something more in depth. I did a video using the movie JFK, but it got copyright blocked, obviously. So that's where I'm going to drop it. I hope this one's enjoyable. It's not as existential, but, kind of is. But hope y'all are doing good. You are loved. And until next time, this side or the other.